This was supposed to be a completely different video. I'd spent about a month writing it, shooting it, editing it, but then events occurred. Oh, and to address the elephant in the room that is the room, I moved. In fact, the video was going to revolve around that. It actually used it as a framing device to talk about how societal change happens. The problem with it was that I was simultaneously triumphant over the fact that I finally got to move out of my moldy, shitty apartment, but I also was wringing my hands about the financial risk that this was for me. And once things happened, I pretty quickly came to the conclusion that that was probably one of the most privileged and tone-deaf things I've ever committed to video. I came very close to posting cringe that frankly would have haunted me. So instead, since I fancy myself a proper lefty communicator, I'm going to talk about these current events. But before I do, a couple quick caveats. First, I believe that these uprisings are justified and ultimately a positive thing. And if that makes you want to click away, then please bear with me. I will get to why I feel this way. This does not mean that I approve of the actions of everyone involved, nor does it mean that I condone violence, and we will talk about violence. Second, these uprisings are primarily about the struggles of a marginalized group that I am not a part of. I am a part of a marginalized group that has tangled with the police in the past. Happy Pride Month, by the way. But while our struggles intersect there, they are very different. And while I do believe that the anger and frustration being expressed in these uprisings has an important class dynamic, and I'm going to talk about it, I understand that that's not what it's about. I'm trying to contextualize this movement. I'm not trying to hijack it. If at any point in this video I say or do something that contradicts the statements I just made, or makes it seem like I don't actually believe those things, please let me know down in the comments. And if you, especially if you are a person of color, do not want to hear a white person talk about these things, you do not have to. The world is chock full of white opinions, and there are many, many people of color who have talked and do talk about these things. I will link some of them down in the description. But the people I want to talk to are the whites. How do you do, fellow white people? How are you holding up? Things are pretty rough out there. I mean, things were rough before people started storming the White House and setting cities on fire, but now who knows what's going on? You may be feeling a number of things. If you're like me, you're disgusted at the gruesome lynching of George Floyd at the hands of the police, and feel like these uprisings are overdue and should receive, at the very least, critical support from anyone who would consider themselves to be an ally. Or you may feel similarly about George Floyd's hideous murder and the many, many more that came before it, but feel like burning and looting and fighting the police is taking things a little too far. Perhaps you feel that nonviolent protest is the only legitimate form of resistance. Or perhaps you feel like the less than peaceful forms of protest that are going on are at least a little justified if they get some murderers put away, but they shouldn't go any further than that. Perhaps you feel that not all cops are bad, even if some or many are, and there is something we have to do about these individuals. Perhaps you feel that how the police do their job needs to be addressed, but the role they serve in society doesn't fundamentally need to change, since at its core their purpose is to keep people safe. If you believe any or all of these things, you are so very close, and I would like you to stick around because I'm going to try to change your mind. However, if you are the type of person who starts sentences with, "his death was tragic," and then proceed to make excuses for extrajudicial killings, such as the past behavior of the victim or how dangerous being a cop is, as though that's an excuse for murder. If you think that the way things are currently done is fine, or if, God forbid, you have one of those Punisher skull thin blue line decals in the back window of your truck, then this video probably doesn't have a very high chance of changing your mind. You can stick around if you like. Part 1. The function of the police. To serve and protect, as the saying goes, and it might surprise you by saying that that is largely true, though the saying is pretty nebulous. Serve who? Protect what? Well, under any system, what a police force primarily protects is the status quo, a status quo enshrined in law, set forth by those with the power to do so. And the further you find yourself from this powerful status quo, the more likely you are to be the one being policed than the one being served and protected. Here in good old-fashioned American capitalism, that status quo is wealthy, affluent, white, straight, cisgender, and male. I list all of these things because they are important in their own way, confer their own advantages. I don't have time to talk about them all, but the axis that confers the most advantages is definitely wealth. For example, a wealthy white straight cis male might do a bunch of shady financial stuff that tanks the economy and ruins millions of lives, and all he'll get is a scolding from the president and a big check. While a working class white straight cis male who steals a shopping cart full of groceries to feed his family, oh, they're gonna get that motherfucker. The cops will hunt them down, pictures of them will be sent to all the grocery stores in the area, and when they catch them, they will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Did you notice that in these examples, the police did nothing when businessmen ruined millions of working class lives, but when a working class person minorly inconveniences a business, they spring into action? 'Cause I did. And just as a quick aside, shoplifting really is a minor inconvenience for places like Walmart. Grocery stores expect to lose a certain amount of their stock to shoplifting. They factor it into their projections. So quite literally, if that one guy got out the door with that one shopping cart, no one would have any idea anything happened at all. It's that minor. But let's get back to the topic at hand and talk about how race factors into this. People of color, especially black folks, have been systematically barred from acquiring wealth for centuries, from slavery to Jim Crow to redlining to predatory lending practices. And every time they do manage to get even kind of a leg up, the rug is pulled out from under them. In both the Great Depression and the Great Recession, black folks lost more than white folks, and this was made only worse by the fact that they already had less. And it's looking very, very likely that we are at the beginnings of another recession, if not a depression, and it would be willfully ignorant of us to assume that black folks aren't feeling that much more than we are right now. And of course, if a lot of people are struggling financially with few ways to make ends meet because businesses don't set up in their neighborhoods because everybody's struggling, then it's guaranteed that some of those people are going to find ways of making ends meet that aren't legal. And since for very, very systemic reasons, it's virtually guaranteed that you can find crime in these neighborhoods, not that you can't find crime in every fucking neighborhood, that's where the police go. And this results in black people having more contact with the police, which is how you end up with situations where, for example, black folks are about 4 times as likely to get arrested for having some weed as are us white people, even though we pretty much all smoke the same amount of weed. Also, more murder. Of course, it's not all about class. Class alone does not explain why cops are more likely to become aggressive with unarmed working-class black people who are doing nothing but be totally comfortable with heavily armed working-class white people yelling at them. Some things are just racism, systemic in nature, but we could get rid of the cops and class tomorrow and it still exists. My point, however, is that it is impossible for the police, as currently constituted, to do their jobs and not do racism. The very system they uphold is racist. You could fire every cop who actively wants to kill black people, and the police would keep inevitably killing black people. let alone arresting them at ridiculously higher rates. This is why all cops are bad. They're not each individually bad. Some, I assume, are good people. All cops are bad because the simple act of being a cop means that you must uphold unjust laws. Laws made by legislators in the pockets of capitalists whose existence relies on the police upholding their racist, exploitative system. Put simply, the role of the police is to serve and protect. The role of the police is to use force, to serve capital and the state, and protect them from us. And those most exploited by the system, those furthest from the status quo, feel it the most when they deem it necessary to use that force. It is simply not possible to be a cop and not do harm. The only way to be a good cop is to not be a cop at all. Part 2. Why the uprisings are good and should continue. At the core of the question of whether or not what's going on currently is morally okay is the issue of violence. Now, I'm not exactly clear on what the mainstream definition of violence actually is. Quite frequently, the actions of protesters is framed as violence, while the actions of the police are not framed as violence. But if you believe that shooting someone in the face with a canister of tear gas isn't violence, I can't help you. However, if you feel like looting and burning businesses is violence, I think I can see where you're coming from, but I have to disagree. I would define violence as, say, willful harm done to people, whether through action or inaction. A broad definition, yes, I know, but it is a broad subject. And yes, this can be extended to include animals, but that's definitely not a fucking conversation for right now. What I completely reject is the idea that violence constitutes harm done to property, particularly if that loss of property has no effect on anyone's material conditions. If you loot all the stuff in a Target, sure, you'll hurt the corporation's bottom line a little bit, but they made like $75 billion in revenue last year, so who fucking cares? A few flat screens going missing is not going to do any harm to them or their employees. Or, let's say, hypothetically, rioters burned down some gentrifying-ass condos that were under construction. No one was in them, and they're probably insured. I mean, the people who are building them might get put out of work, but why? The site still needs to be cleaned up. They can be rebuilt. There's plenty of work. Real estate is such an immorally lucrative business that that company will almost certainly rebuild those condos so that they can sit empty as an investment for rich people. Will never use them while homeless people in Minneapolis freeze to death. A system that lets people die in the streets while there is significantly more than enough housing in order to prevent this does a great deal more violence than any riot, especially when that system is backed up by a privileged class of thugs who can kill with 100% impunity. I'm not saying, of course, that violence doesn't occur at riots. That would be ridiculous. People get assaulted, injured, and killed during them all the time. If, say, a small business owner gets their shop ransacked or burned down and they can't afford decent insurance, so they can't afford to rebuild, then that's real harm. Now, the insurance company who rejected them did take part in that harm, but so too did the people who ransacked them. But let's set that aside and just say, for the sake of argument, it's all violence. The burning, the looting, all of it. The fact of the matter is that sometimes violence is necessary. And if you're one of those people who believes that violence never solves anything, then I would like to ask you what you would have done about Nazi Germany. Yes, I know, Godwin's law, it's not a fair comparison. Burning and looting corporate buildings is not the same as fighting to end fascism. Not that fascism ever ended. And boy, the police do sure seem to have some friendly associations with fascists. Anyway, what most people mean when they insist that protests should be peaceful is that violence is a counterproductive political strategy, and in most cases, this is true. Cops will often try to bait protesters into lashing out so that they will look justified in using violence to shut down the protests. But nobody plans a riot. Riots can present certain political opportunities, but there's no strategy here. Riots are a reaction, an expression of frustration and oppression that cannot be expressed any other way. These folks tried kneeling respectfully during the national anthem, and they got called traitors, and nothing changed. They tried insisting peacefully that Black Lives Matter as much as everyone else's, and they got called racists, and nothing changed. They tried commandeering the microphones from politicians at demonstrations and rallies, and they got called belligerent and disruptive, and nothing changed. Just what the fuck did you expect them to do next? John F. Kennedy wasn't the coolest dude ever, but he did once correctly point out that those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. You can condemn the actions of the rioters all you want, but you may as well condemn the actions of a hurricane. Naturally, folks who insist that peaceful protest is the only, or at least superior form of political action often invoke Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, this tends to make me rather angry, for two reasons. Firstly, it is very often cynically employed by the right, the sorts of people who criticize any political action by black folks and then use the memory of one of their most well-respected dissidents to get them to shut up altogether. And while I do believe that most people who say things like MLK wouldn't have condoned this kind of action are being sincere and really do believe in peaceful protest, but the second reason that this makes me angry is that it at best demonstrates an ignorance of Dr. King's full views on riots. Yes, King consistently condemned riots, which were a much larger part of the civil rights movement than you were probably led to believe, and he truly did believe that nonviolent political action was more effective, but he never condemned rioting without also contextualizing it, often calling riots the language of the unheard. In his 1967 challenge to the nation's social scientists, he said,
"Urban riots must now be recognized as durable social phenomena. They may be deplored, but they are there and should be understood. Urban riots are a special form of violence. They are not insurrections. The rioters are not seeking to seize territory or to attain control of institutions. They are mainly intended to shock the white community. They are a distorted form of social protest. The looting, which is their principal feature, serves many functions. It enables the most enraged and deprived black person to take hold of consumer goods with the ease that the white man does by using his purse. Often the black person does not even want what he takes. He wants the experience of taking. But most of all, alienated from society and knowing that this society cherishes property above all, he is shocking it by abusing property rights." A profound judgment of today's riots was expressed by Victor Hugo a century ago. He said, "If a soul is left in the darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness." The policymakers of the white society have caused the darkness. They create discrimination, they structured slums, and they perpetuate unemployment, ignorance, and poverty. It is incontestable and deplorable that black people have committed crimes, but they are derivative crimes. They are born of the greater crimes of white society. The slums are the handiwork of a vicious system of the white society. Black people live in them, but they do not make them any more than a prisoner makes a prison. Let us say boldly that if the violations of law by the white man in the slums over the years were calculated and compared with the lawbreaking of a few days of riots, the hardened criminal would be the white man. These are often difficult things to say, but I have come to see more and more that it is necessary to utter the truth in order to deal with the great problems that we face in our society.
So if the way you're viewing these uprisings is that they are a reaction to the murder of George Floyd, then yeah, they seem like a bit of an overreaction. But if you view them as they actually are, a reaction to hundreds of years of systemic abuse that was triggered by the murder of George Floyd, then frankly, they're an underreaction. Also, you could see why people might get upset if you condemn the rioting without condemning what causes them, even if you are condemning what triggers them. Your picture is incomplete. And that's intentional. The idea that racism is an interpersonal and not a systemic issue is drilled into us. And we don't talk about rioting in schools, for example, and the fact that so many are ignorant of King's more nuanced views on rioting is a part of that. And the reason for that is that riots scare the ever-living shit out of the powerful. There is, after all, a very fine line between an uprising and a full-on insurrection. Riots are an incredible source of political pressure. For example, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, riots swept the entire country. I mean, what did you expect black folks to do after you killed the one guy who was telling everyone to cool their jets and do things peacefully? And as a result of the worst wave of unrest since the Civil War, Congress fucking scrambled to pass the Civil Rights Act. The groundwork had been laid by decades of peaceful resistance, but it was a series of riots in the wake of the death of a black man that got Congress to actually get up off their ass and fucking do something. So I have hope that these uprisings will ultimately be positive. I mean, Congress sucks more than they usually do, and the president is a fascist, so I don't expect these riots to provide the necessary pressure, but I do think we're going to be seeing more events like these. Especially in a country where the president encourages more violence from the police and the inevitable recession that results from COVID-19 and other factors deepens and pushes more and more people into financial corners. So the police serve the status quo, and the riots highlight the need for change and also provide the political pressure necessary to achieve that change. But what change exactly? Part 3. Change. Change can be very, very scary. When people are calling for the police to be defunded, demilitarized, or even outright dismantled, it can be very easy to just reject that idea when people are burning their own cities down. I mean, how are we going to deal with this without a fully funded police department with every available tool at their disposal? But the point of defanging the police is to create a world where events like this are less likely to happen, an attempt to deal with the underlying causes of rioting. Remember that riots are brought on by racial inequalities, by class inequalities, and by many other inequalities that are imposed on us by a wealthy class and enforced by the police. That is their primary function. If they had their money and their weapons taken away, or if they were abolished altogether, it would become infinitely easier for us to combat those inequalities and create a world where the conditions that lead to rioting don't exist. Other than football games, of course. Many of the groups protesting currently have the defunding or the disarmament of the police as part of their chief demands. I would agree that taking away their tanks, grenades, and their overall ability to kill is the bare minimum. Police militarization and police brutality go hand in fucking hand. I, however, favor the complete and total abolition of the police, and I know that sounds like a completely wild idea. So let me be clear, there are necessary functions that the police perform, and I do want them performed, but the police are really, really bad at them. The police don't do law enforcement very well. This is due largely to the fact that the law is set up to protect capital and the state from the common people, and giving a group that kind of unassailable authority creates a special class of people, making egalitarian law enforcement completely impossible. Much of the rest of what they do would be handled better by trained social workers, such as hostage situations, suicide prevention, and domestic abuse. Drug use shouldn't even be a crime at all, but a medical issue. Wouldn't it be better and more productive if when someone pulled you over because the tabs on your license plate were expired, that they ordered you new tabs from that computer that's sitting in their car instead of printing you off a ticket and costing you more money? Sure, sometimes when your car breaks down, a cop pulls over to check to see if you're okay or if you need a tow, but, like, fucking anyone can do that. Wouldn't it be better if the person who does that has zero chance of arresting you or killing you? The vast majority of police interactions do not solve problems, they compound them. And once we've taken away their ability to escalate situations, separated out their responsibilities into a number of disparate groups, and made them accountable to their communities as opposed to the state, they're not really the police anymore. But whatever measures we believe need to be taken, it's undeniable that they do need to be taken, that we live in a time of unprecedented change. You can fight it, you can run from it, you can pretend it's not happening, but it'll happen all the same. And it's long since past time that the entire working class, especially my fellow white people, started listening to the most marginalized among us because they knew long before we did that this shit needed to change. And they also knew long before we did that we can apply the right pressures and make those in power enact that change. Or alternatively, we could take that power and make the change ourselves.
Come gather around, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are a-changing. Come writers and critics who prophesize with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin. There's no telling who that it's naming, for the loser now will be later to win, for the times they are a-changing. Come senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall, for they that get hurt will be they who have stalled. There's a battle outside and it's raging. It'll soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are changing. Come mothers and fathers throughout the land, what you can understand. Your children now are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend a hand, for the times they are a-changing. The line it is drawn and the curse it is cast. The slow one now will later be fast, as the present now will later be the past. The order is rapidly fading, and the first one now will later be the last, for the times they are a-changing.
So for the next while, I'm planning on releasing a few videos that are just going to be cover songs like that last song you just heard while I work on bigger projects. I think it's a good idea for me to do my part and prevent the narrative around this movement from being dominated by white people. I've said my piece, and I think that's sufficient. But hey, look, I got patrons. So thanks to Monkey Revolution and Rebecca Solar Willpower for supporting me. Special thanks to my friend Monkey Revolution, who pointed out that I hadn't set up my Patreon tiers. And so the minimum donation was $3 a month, which is a little steep. Anyway, the minimum is now $1 a month. So, if I get a decent schedule going, I'll start releasing videos early there. Maybe even have some polls or whatnot there, for what I'm going to do for my next video. So yeah, if you wanted to support me in the past, but didn't want to pay $3 a month, still don't. I mean, you can, it's just $1, but there's so many organizations out there doing essential and important work right now. Right now is a really crucial moment, and there are a lot of organizations that could use that dollar a lot more than my dinky little YouTube channel. So, some of them are right here, and they'll be linked down in the description. Support them instead. Don't support me. All right, I'm going to go unpack now because I've been moved for over a month and I still haven't unpacked everything naturally. So stay safe, stay vigilant, stay radical. Cheers.